Globally, Boeing is the largest airplane manufacturer. It's actually a pretty close race between Boeing and Airbus, but in the US, Boeing is a clear winner. Although they make lots of stuff for NASA and the military, their biggest and most well-known segment is commercial airplanes. Take your commercial flights on Delta or United. Your plane was probably made by Boeing, potentially their 737 or 757, maybe even the 747, which I'll be talking more about later. Clearly, it is a big business. The planes aren't cheap. Some of Boeing's peak revenue came in 2018 when they made over $1 billion. Boeing is one of the oldest, biggest and most valuable companies in the world. Today, I want to discuss some of the past rises and falls of Boeing. There were 3 distinct times when the company was significantly downsized and in real danger of shutting down altogether. In any of those cases, if things hadn't gone differently, we would not have the Boeing company today. Boeing is named after William Boeing. Before he was born, his father, Wilhelm Boeing, had immigrated to the US and started a successful lumber business in Detroit. When William was 8 years old, his father went on a business trip to New York and caught the flu while he was there. He died on the train ride back home in 1889. This left William with some land that his father owned. William then attended Yale University to study engineering a decade later, but he dropped out a year before completing the program to pursue his own interests. The land he had inherited from his family was suitable for a lumber business and he saw it as an opportunity. It was the right time because new homes were being built and businesses were expanding, being constructed, and he knew that they were going to need to buy some wood to do it. It proved to be a successful venture, and he moved his business after 5 years from Michigan to the state of Washington. There is a reputation in Washington for their evergreen tree, so it made sense while he was there, he started developing this big interest in aviation. At a 1910 air meet in Los Angeles, he was unable to convince any of the pilots to take him up in their plane. A pilot said he would do it, but then left without telling him. It's funny because there was a time when pilots from all over the world wouldn't give any attention to William Boeing, and it took another 5 years before he actually rode on a plane. At that point, he had become friends with another aviation enthusiast, G. Conrad Westervelt. He was an MIT graduate that was serving in the Navy. As a result of scheduling some plane rides, the two of them came to take flying lessons and eventually bought a plane. William Boeing didn't really like that plane. It was too loud and unstable for him. Using some of the resources from that lumber business, the two of them built the first ever Boeing airplane with a team of about 12 people. They called it Model 1, or the BW short for Boeing and Westerville. They now had a functioning plane. The plane creating hobby of William Boeing turned into a business. Almost immediately, he founded Pacific Aero Products, not the catchiest name, but a year later, he renamed it Boeing Airplane Company. That also happened to be the same year that the US entered World War I. Fortunately for Boeing, the Navy suddenly needed a lot of planes and Boeing was awarded multiple contracts. Boeing's initial rise can be attributed to that, but its decline comes soon after. Boeing's first fall was in 1918 when the war ended. Boeing no longer had any customers. As a result, Boeing was forced to cut back almost immediately when the Navy no longer needed their planes. Boeing was forced to lay off employees. They went from over 300 of them to under 100. It was tough for those 100 remaining ones sometimes because they were paid in company stock instead of cash, which was not worth much. The company no longer made airplanes and nobody was buying them, so they stopped. As a result, they were forced to build boats and even furniture. Repairs and refurbishments for the US Army saved them somewhat by refurbishing some of their planes, but their big break didn't come until 1927. 2 years earlier, the US Postal Service was giving the option of hiring firms to deliver mail using airplanes instead of doing it themselves. As a result, Boeing, with its newly created Model 48 plane, won the mail route from Chicago to San Francisco. They became an airline as well as a plane manufacturer. Boeing then created a company to buy their planes, the Boeing Transport Company from the Boeing Airplane Company. Are you able to see how that vertical monopoly was forming here? Over the next few years, Boeing would acquire or merge with all of their competitors. Boeing would acquire engine manufacturers, other airlines and other plane manufacturers. As a result, Boeing monopolized the industry. I know it wasn't good, but it was impressive that within a decade's time, they went from the brink of bankruptcy to dominating that market. This is about as big a comeback as you can imagine. Boeing's second fall came in 1934 after the Reservoir Administration put an end to it. The details are messy, but the intention was to break up the monopoly. A law prohibited the same company from manufacturing planes and delivering mail. Having formed such a giant company, Boeing now violated the law. After being forced to break up, the one large company was divided into 3 separate smaller ones. They were called Boeing, United Aircraft, who you may know as United Technologies, and United Airlines, who you may know as United Airlines. As chairman and major shareholder, William Boeing took advantage of this opportunity to exit the company. As a result, he left his position, sold his stock, and had very little involvement for the remaining 22 years of his life. Even though they were forced into it, this still qualifies as a major fall, but again, they were lifted up by war. For the military, they produced bomber planes during World War II. The B-17 Flying Fortress was big, and the B-29 was actually the plane that was used to drop both atomic bombs on Japan. Well after the war in the 1950s is when they pushed their way back into commercial travel. In the propeller plane market, Douglas had been the leader, so when Boeing entered the space, they introduced their much larger, faster jetliner called the 707. During the late 1950s, it became very popular. It wasn't the first of its kind, but it was the first to become successful. In response to that success, Boeing followed up with the 727, 737 and 747, which brings me to their next fall. The idea behind the 747 was that it was huge. It could accommodate well over 350 passengers, which is practically twice as many as the 707 or any other plane. The reason they wanted to seat so many people is that throughout the 1960s, air travel was skyrocketing in popularity at a rate of 10% each year. Then Boeing realized these airlines would need bigger planes if that number kept increasing. They took on this massively risky project of developing the 747 at that time, which proved to be one of the biggest projects in the country's history. In order to fund it, they sold stock, took out loans, obtained a line of credit, and it put them over $1 billion in debt. With that money, they were able to create a marvel of science. In 1968, they introduced it and initially sold far fewer than they anticipated. Back then, you wouldn't believe how many things went wrong for Boeing related to the 747. It was based on the prediction that air travel would continue to rise. Due to the recession, people weren't traveling nearly as much as they had expected. Such a large plane wasn't very useful to airlines. Another factor would be the Vietnam War winding down. The Nixon administration had started withdrawing the troops from Vietnam, and it meant that there were fewer sales for Boeing. Similarly, NASA was winding down its Apollo program. Boeing had been developing rocket boosters and other various things for their trips to the moon, and since that was ending, these sales were gone as well. Last but not least, I would like to mention supersonic transport. In 1966, President Kennedy introduced this program that called for the creation of this really big and fast aircraft. Boeing won the contract to make it, but the government stopped funding it by 1971. As a result, Boeing needed the government's money to develop its aircraft, and it was suddenly gone. Side note, do you remember the NBA team, the Seattle Supersonics? Well, that team started right after Boeing won the contract to make the supersonic transport. The team was named after the city because it was such a big deal, so you can try to imagine being hit by all of these factors at once. In the belief that they would be able to repay the loan, they borrowed over $1 billion. However, they were suddenly gone. In my opinion, this is similar to buying a house and then losing your job shortly thereafter. Seattle's unemployment rate reached almost 14% in 1971 when Boeing laid off more than half of its 40,000 employees. Those people couldn't find jobs in the area, so they started leaving and the whole local economy started crashing down. By the end of the decade, the recessions had ended, which meant air travel was back. Up there was finally a demand for their massive 747s, and they were finally starting to see a much better return on their investment. They were also selected for some notable military contracts, and by the end of the decade, they had almost fully recovered over them. In the next 50 or so years, they sold over 1,500 747s and have announced that they will be discounting their production of them in 2022. There you have it, 3 separate occurrences where Boeing was significantly reduced in size and almost forced to shut down. Let me know in the comments what do you think of all of these close calls. Subscribe to our channel for more business stories.